Hello everyone and welcome back. In this new lesson we're going to continue the implementation of our messages service. This is the shared service that allows components such as for example the home component in our application to show error messages to the user using the error messages panel in a decoupled way by calling the messages service show errors public method. When we call show errors, the messages service will know to which instance of the messages panel to deliver the messages. So let's talk about the public API of the messages service. The messages service is going to be injected not only in our home component or in any other component under the application root component tree that needs to show errors to the user, but the messages service will also be injected, of course, in our messages component. So our messages component is going to receive here in our constructor an instance of the messages service. Just like the case of the loading component, also the messages component might potentially have multiple instances in our application. So let's add here some logging in our constructor and let's write here the message created messages component. This will help us to better understand how this component is used by our application. Now let's talk about how will the messages component interact with the messages service. So as usual, our messages service is going to be providing here in its public API an observable, and this is going to be the errors observable. This is going to be an observable that emits as values string arrays. So our arrays are in this implementation lists of strings. Using this errors observable, the messages component is going to be able to access the messages and display them to the user. Now let's make this messages service public so that it's reachable here via the template, and here in our template we are going to subscribe to the errors observable. We are going to be subscribing to the errors observable using the Angular ngIf syntax, and because we are already using here ngIf, let's use here an ng container in order to apply another structural directive. Let's remember that we cannot have two instances of ngIf applied to the same element, and also we don't want to put another div around the messages container if we don't have to. So we're going to be using here ng container, and we're going to be using the ngIf Angular structural directive. We're going to be accessing here the messages service, which is wrongly named. Let me quickly fix that. It's the messages service. Let's then access it here from ngIf. We are going to be accessing here the errors observable, and we're going to be subscribing to it using the Angular async pipe. We are going to be aliasing the values emitted by the errors observable. Let's name this the errors local template variable. So this is an array of errors that is going to be available here to be displayed to the template using the ng-for directive. Now all we have to do is to implement these errors observable in our messages service. Let's switch here to our messages service and see how we are going to create this observable. So this observable is supposed to emit a new value whenever we call here show errors. Just like before, we are going to be implementing this custom observable by using a private subject. Let's define it here. We're going to define here a member variable called subject. Again, we're going to be using the behavior subject, which has the added advantage of remembering the last value emitted by the subject and making it immediately available to new subscribers. Just like the errors observable, this behavior subject is going to be emitting string arrays, which are going to be our application error messages. The initial value that we're going to be emitting is going to be the empty array. Just like before, we're going to be using the subject in order to create our errors observable. So the subject has the ability of emitting new values, new lists of errors, but the errors observable, on the other hand, does not provide that same ability. So we cannot use the public errors observable in order to emit new errors. If we want to emit new errors, we need to call here the show errors API. Let's now define here the errors observable. We are going to derive this observable again from the subject. We're going to apply here as observable, and this is going to create a new observable that emits the same values as the subject, with the difference that with the errors observable, we cannot emit new values directly. We can only subscribe to them. Now all we have to do is to implement here the showErrors method. We're going to be calling here our subject, and we're going to call next on it in order to emit a new value of the errors observable. Let's pass in here the value that we want to emit, which is this new list of errors that we have received here. And with this we have finished the implementation of the messages service. Let's now finish the implementation of our messages component. As we have seen, we are using here the messages service and we are subscribing to the errors observable in order to pass the errors to the template. But the error messages are only going to be shown if this flag is set to true. So before showing the messages to the user, let's now see how can we set this flag to true whenever a new value gets emitted by the errors observable. I think that instead of subscribing directly here to the errors observable and setting the flag to true whenever a new value gets emitted, what we can do alternatively is to create here a new errors observable at the level of our messages component. So this is also going to be an observable that emits string arrays as values, which are going to be our errors. Now what we're going to do is we are going to consume this errors observable, which we have not yet defined, in our template. We are going to consume it here instead of the errors observable that is coming directly from the messages service. Let's now see how we are going to implement this errors observable. We are going to be deriving this local errors observable from the messages service errors observable. And we're going to be applying here the pipe operator, and as a side effect of each value emitted by the messages service errors observable, we are going to be setting the show messages flag to true. Let's apply here the tap operator and let's then set the flag to true. Now, one last but important detail, let's remember that this errors observable will initially emit the empty array. So we don't want that empty array value to trigger here the display of messages to the user. Let's then change here the implementation of our errors observable and let's filter out this initial value, the empty array. We're going to be using here the observable pipe syntax, and we are going to pipe here the RxJS filter operator. Here we are going to take the messages and we're going to make sure that the messages array is not empty. Let's first confirm that the messages array exists, and if that is the case, we are going to then check the length of the messages array in order to make sure that it's larger than 0. And with this last functionality in place, we have now finished the implementation of our messages service. So let's go again through our solution. Whenever a call to our backend fails, such as for example here this call to load all courses, we are going to get here an error. Using the catch error RxJS operator, we can then catch the error and use the messages service showErrors public method in order to display an error message to the user. The home component does not know how the message is going to be displayed to the user, it simply knows about the messages service. The messages service is then going to emit via the errors observable a new value informing any part of the Angular application that needs to be notified that an error occurred. In our case, the messages component is then going to get notified via the errors observable that a new set of error messages need to be displayed to the user. This component is going to then set the show messages flag to true. That is going to trigger here the display of a panel containing the error messages that we want to show to the user. The panel is closable here via the close icon. And with this, our messages functionality is ready to be tested, and all we need now is to trigger some sort of error in our application. Now our home component is calling here load all courses. Let's quickly modify our backend in order to force an error to occur when this API gets called. We're going to open here our server folder where our small REST API server is running that is serving here the list of courses. Here under the get courses route, we have here a very simple express route handler that is sending back to the client this list of courses that we see here on the screen. Let's modify this implementation and have it throw an error. Let's comment out here the correct implementation and notice here that inside this comment we have an implementation that always throws an error. So we're going to see here on the console log of the server, not of the browser, that there was an error loading the courses, and we're going to send back the HTTP status code 500 internal server error back to the browser with a small JSON payload saying simply that an error occurred. Let's now run this new version of our backend. We're going to go to the terminal and we're going to stop our server by pressing Ctrl+C. Let's now run our new server with this new version of get courses by running the command npm run server. Let's now make sure that we are running the Angular CLI in our second terminal using always the command npm start. And with this, we are now ready to try out our error handling functionality. I'm going to switch here to a larger window and I'm going to reload the application. So this is still an old version of the application because we had there a list of courses. As we can see, as the application started up, we got here an error back from our backend. We can see it also here in our network tab. It's the request to /API/courses that return here 500 internal server error with the payload error occurred. We can also see that our messages panel is working correctly here as expected. So the messages panel extends through the whole top section of our application and it can be closed as well. So if I click here on the close icon, the messages are going to be hidden as expected. And with this we can see that our messages component is working as expected. Let's now see how can we apply the same functionality to the edit course dialog.